Hideo Kojima, one of the greatest video game directors of all time. And I'm not just saying that because I'm a fanboy. Hideo Kojima guided the Metal Gear franchise from its inception in 1987 until 2015's Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain. While he departed the publisher Konami under bad circumstances, he has since released the incredibly unique Death Stranding, proving that he's not quite done sharing his art with the world. Even if The Phantom Pain was the last thing he did, the Metal Gear series has created an eternal legacy within the medium. The game's story spans 6 different decades. It can be pretty hard to keep track of the Metal Gear chronology. So with that being said, welcome back to Game Rant. My name is Casey, and this is every Metal Gear game in chronological order and the year they take place in. The first game on our list is Metal Gear Solid 3: Snake Eater, released in 2004 and takes place in 1964. This is the game that planted the seeds for the overarching conflict between the major characters. Funny enough, fans didn't realize its importance in the canon upon release. Fans could infer the boss's major role in the series given who her protege would become, but Major Zero, Paramedic, and Sigint felt rather innocent compared to who they'd be revealed to be in Metal Gear Solid 4 in 2008. Despite being the third numbered entry, Metal Gear Solid 3 works well as a standalone title since it precedes every other game. The PS3 360 port sacrifices the original PS2 bonus features for pristine HD graphics running at a smooth 60 frames per second. It's this port that's due to appear in the MGS Master Collection. The Nintendo 3DS version also utilizes the handheld's gimmick for some 3D fun. Up next, we have Metal Gear Solid Portable Ops, released in 2006 and takes place in 1970. This portable spin-off is somewhat canon as it's referenced in later games but only tangentially. It details how Big Boss and a young Roy Campbell team up to stop the Fox unit and eventually lead the way to its replacement in Foxhound. It's also the chronological debut of Gray Fox, who'd later become MGS1's Cyborg Ninja. The gameplay introduces many elements later titles like Peace Walker would expand upon, like recruiting enemy guards to Boss's side. Unfortunately, Portable Ops was never brought to consoles, so a PSP is needed if one wishes to jump back into this title. That is, if it doesn't end up on the Master Collection Volume 2. Up next, we've got Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker, released in 2010 and takes place in 1974. The events of Peace Walker led directly into Ground Zeroes and The Phantom Pain. While it was originally released on the PSP, it found a wider audience via the HD collection on PS3 and 360. This game shows how Big Boss began to oppose Major Zero over their ways of creating the boss's world without borders. The former wants to do it by turning everyone into weapons, and the latter aims to do it by controlling every weapon. Taking place in Costa Rica, most of the plot deals with colonialism and the Cold War. The game is rated T, so it's not as violent as other entries, but the story still hits hard and takes dark turns. While the game was made with the PSP in mind, it plays excellently, if not better, on the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. Here's hoping it'll get a re-release someday. Next, we've got Metal Gear Solid 5: Ground Zeroes, released in 2014 and taking place in 1975. In retrospect, Ground Zeroes existing as a separate release from The Phantom Pain is seen as one of the first signs of Konami's meddling. It's said it was always intended to be part of the full MGS5 package, as it shows how Big Boss went from trying to rescue his comrades from Peace Walker to being a comatose shell in Phantom Pain. But it was separated to recoup the funds invested in its production. As such, it became more of a very pricey demo for Phantom Pain. The main story took about an hour to beat and less so for veteran players. But it came with plenty of extras like the quirky Deja Vu and Jamais Vu missions. Nowadays, it can be found for much cheaper prices, often packaged with Phantom Pain as MGS5 The Definitive Experience. Up next, we've got Metal Gear Survive, released in 2018, taking place in 1975. The black sheep of the MGS series is the first chronological alternate timeline. Metal Gear Survive is a zombie survival game following a group of soldiers from Mother Base who are somehow sucked into another dimension after Skullface attacks it at the end of Ground Zeroes. It adds absolutely nothing to the story, is clearly not canon, and Hideo Kojima wasn't even involved in the production in the slightest. A lot of negativity followed it leading up to its release, namely Kojima's departure and the allegations over how Konami treated its staff. The actual game did nothing to change that, as it was basically just Metal Gear Solid 5 with shoehorned in crafting, hunger and thirst mechanics, and price gouging. That, and as absurd as Metal Gear gets, fighting zombies in another dimension was a step too far. This just wasn't Metal Gear at that point, but a trend-chasing cash grab. Up next, we've got Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain, released in 2015, taking place in 1984. Had the Phantom Pain been given the development time to do all it was set out to do, the series would have finally come full circle, connecting the prequel games to the original Metal Gear. Instead, thanks to the strained relationship between Kojima and Konami, the final game was left missing some key ingredients. For example, Kojima hinted players could return to Ground Zeroe's Camp Omega, which they can't. Many of the side ops are repeated because the dev team didn't have time to make original ones on par with Peace Walker. Then, most notoriously of them all, the Kingdom of Flies mission, which saw Venom, Snake, and Eli's arcs get wrapped up, was never finished, reduced to a work-in-progress extra on special editions of the game. Still, the story had some good ideas and the gameplay was top-notch. If only it had a director's cut edition like Death Stranding to close off those missing plot threads. Up next, we've got the very first Metal Gear, released in 1987, taking place in 1995. Solid Snake makes his debut as a rookie Foxhound agent sent into Outer Heaven by Big Boss to save Grey Fox and stop the titular nuclear bipedal tank. This game is quite quaint by today's standards, but it shows many of the traits future stealth action classics would follow. While it still has its twists, its storytelling is surprisingly quick and straightforward thanks to the MSX's memory constraints. Kojima's trademark verbosity would have to wait for its sequel to arrive. The easiest way to play it today is through the Metal Gear Solid HD Collection's version of MGS3, which is due to also appear in the Master Collection. The NES port, while popular for its infamous localization job, isn't as solid as the MSX original, though it's still better than the stodgier C64 version. Up next, we've got Snake's Revenge, released in 1990 and takes place in 1998. Some older gamers might have a fondness for Snake's Revenge, as it's actually a touch better than the NES Metal Gear. Nonetheless, it still has some of its flaws and told its own non-canon story without Kojima's involvement. In response, he made his own canon sequel for the MSX2 in Metal Gear Solid Snake. Despite still being developed by Konami, it was exclusive to the West and has never been re-released since 1990. As such, it's a hard game to find officially. Not that Konami, Kojima, or anyone else would be upset if it was picked up unofficially, as Snake's Revenge has largely been swept under the rug. Up next, we've got Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake, released in 1990 and takes place in 1999. The true canon sequel to Metal Gear establishes the formula future games would follow more effectively. The extra memory gave players a radar to spot soldiers and their field of vision, and mech bosses like the Hind D and Metal Gear itself could actually move and fight. The story also has Kojima's touch all over it, with grandiose speeches, high drama, and sudden twists. Many of its elements would actually get included in its sequel Metal Gear Solid, from fighting soldiers in elevators to old allies becoming cybernetic villains. In fact, it was almost enough for people to think that MGS1 was a remake of the MSX2 game. Maybe Kojima and company thought they could get away with it because Metal Gear 2 wasn't officially released in the West until it was featured on Metal Gear Solid 3 Subsistence. It's also on the HD Collection and the upcoming Master Collection. Up next, we've got Metal Gear Ghost Babel, released in 2000 and takes place in 2002. Released simply as Metal Gear Solid in the West, the game follows an alternate timeline from the MSX games, which sees Snake return to the remains of Outer Heaven to stop bad guys from using a new Metal Gear to threaten the world. The gameplay follows the style of the MSX games too, shifting to the Game Boy Color's limited buttons with ease. It also offers 90 VR missions to go through in addition to the main story and a teaser for one of the main series games at the end. Unfortunately, it's never been re-released since its debut in 2000, and finding working Game Boy Colors these days is kinda tricky as well. For anyone that does, it's best to pick up a European copy of the game as it comes with a region-exclusive feature on New Game Plus. And up next, we've got the iconic Metal Gear Solid, released in 1998 and taking place in 2005. The MSX games may be where the series started, but it was this 1998 classic that truly skyrocketed the series and Kojima to their legendary status. It sees Solid Snake get brought out of retirement to stop his old Foxhound unit from using Metal Gear Rex to launch a nuke, all while facing his own past in the process. While future entries would expand upon the gameplay, Metal Gear Solid still holds up fantastically today with its smooth controls and inventive gameplay. That Psycho Mantis fight where you have to use the different controller ports to get the drop on him, it's truly outstanding. That boss fight was way ahead of its time. Even so, there are calls for it to be remade, or at least for its GameCube remake The Twin Snakes to get a re-release. But yeah, please don't do that, Konami. Metal Gear Solid is perfect the way it is. Up next, we've got Metal Gear Solid Mobile, released in 2008 and taking place from 2005 to 2007. Metal Gear Solid Mobile is an early mobile game that's almost impossible to find through legitimate channels these days. It's not really a hidden gem either, as it seems to have passed by most players without much notice. The most interesting aspect of it is its story. Set after the events of Metal Gear Solid, it sees Solid Snake help Dr. Victoria Reed in order to obtain intel on the construction of a new Metal Gear model. However, it turns out to be a ploy to trap Snake in a VR simulation. It's ultimately inconsequential as Snake gets mind-wiped at the end, though the ending teases that this is the same VR regimen used by Raiden in MGS2. And speaking of MGS2, up next we've got Metal Gear Solid 2, released in 2001 and takes place from 2007 to 2009. The first part of Metal Gear Solid 2 takes place in 2007 and shows Solid Snake infiltrating a tanker for info on a new Metal Gear prototype. Then Kojima threw fans a curveball when the second chapter was set on a plant 2 years later and replaced Solid Snake with Raiden. He was always planned to be the main protagonist, though Konami, Kojima, and company managed to keep him a secret until after the game's release, replacing him with Snake in the trailers. While this did anger some fans, they gradually came around as its bizarre plot about the control of digital information became more prescient over the years. Its other twisting elements on the nature of identity were inspired by Paul Auster's New York trilogy books, to the point where Raiden was originally going to have a support team named after the characters from its first book, City of Glass. Up next, we've got Metal Gear Solid 4: Guns of the Patriots, released in 2008 and takes place in 2014. Solid Snake's final chapter sees him as a prematurely aged old man with one last mission in him: dispatch Liquid Ocelot, the series' cowboy-obsessed triple agent completely possessed by Snake's brother Liquid Snake. Metal Gear Solid 4 began as a PlayStation 3 exclusive and is still stuck on the console to this day. Unless it gets a re-release, fans will have to fish out their old consoles to see how Snake's story ends. Hideo Kojima originally planned to have Snake and Otacon executed for their crimes, similar to the 1970s Italian drama Sacco and Vanzetti. His colleagues ultimately talked him out of it, giving Snake and Otacon a more happy ending. One that's an hour and a half long. As fun as the gameplay is, the cutscenes are much more indulgent and lengthy compared to the rest of the series. Up next, we've got Metal Gear Acid, released in 2005 and takes place in 2016. When fans were wondering what the first handheld Metal Gear since Ghost Babel would be like, they probably weren't expecting it to be a tactical, collectible card-based RPG. It doesn't follow any of the other games in the series, as Snake and his partner Teleco have to save a US senator from bad guys and learn just what the secret to the Pythagoras Project is. Back in the PSP's early days, it was an easy recommendation because it was one of the system's best games. It was also effectively exclusive to the handheld, with only an obscure, less good Java port for mobile phones. Nowadays, while it's fine enough for fans of card-based games, it's a little too strange for a Metal Gear game, and it would only get stranger. Up next, we've got Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance, released in 2013, taking place in 2018. This spin-off from Platinum Games is also the last in the main Metal Gear chronology. Despite the gameplay going down the character action game route, similar to Bayonetta or Devil May Cry, the story remains a distinctly Metal Gear tale. It sees Raiden, now working as a bodyguard, trying to stop Desperado enforcement from starting a war, complete with a conspiracy involving kidnapped children, AI, and
nanomachines, son.
Metal Gear Rising was really popular on its 2013 release, and a sequel seemed guaranteed until Konami and Kojima's fallout. The game has still retained its charm after a decade thanks to its gameplay, story, and characters. Perhaps if Metal Gear Solid Delta succeeds, fans will finally get a Metal Gear Rising 2. That is, if Konami and Platinum Games can still work out a deal and bring that old magic back. Up next, we've got Metal Gear Acid 2, released in 2006 and takes place in 2019. The Acid games are proof that the series could be strange even without Kojima directly involved. Both games were primarily made by Tomokazu Fukushima, Shuyo Murata, and Shinta Nojiri, who previously created the more grounded Ghost Babel game. Acid 2 brought back the turn-based card gameplay, and saw an amnesiac Snake and Venus stop the Doctor and his Saint Logic organization from using Metal Gear Chai Tao Kadish. It sounds straightforward enough, but it only gets stranger as the plot introduces clones, switching allegiances, hypnotism, kid hackers, and reincarnation. It plays better than Acid 1, though making sense of it is a trial in itself. Up next, we've got Policenauts, released in 1994 and takes place in 2040. Hideo Kojima's visual novels aren't strictly part of the Metal Gear series, but some of the game's events are part of their canon. For example, the MSX games are both canon to Policenauts, as lead character Jonathan Ingram is sent to the Beyond Space Coast colony to investigate a series of murders alongside his former Policenaut and LAPD partner Ed Brown on his Vice Squad. One of his team members happens to be Meryl Silverberg from Metal Gear Solid, except she says she aided Snake during the events of Metal Gear 2 in 1999. Aside from her not being in that game, this would make her nearly 60 years old in Policenauts. Then again, Jonathan himself was stuck in suspended animation for 30 years, so maybe Meryl took a decade off as well. The game was never released officially in the West, but there are English patches for the Saturn and 3DO ports. And the final game released in this series chronologically is Snatcher, released in 1988 and takes place in 2047. While Policenauts is technically more advanced than its older predecessor, Snatcher tells a better story. After the world recovers from a global pandemic, population centers find themselves threatened by robots called Snatchers. They dispatch their targets, then steal their identities. It's up to Junker agent Gillian Seed to discover their weak points, where they came from, and their connection to his amnesia. Metal Gear is a canon event to the game, given Gillian's robot buddy is modeled after the TX-55 from that game. He even comes out to the game's main theme. The two also visit a bar called Outer Heaven, named after Big Boss's military nation. Though given its lethal pandemic began in 1996, it's safe to say that the later games didn't happen in its timeline. The game was released in the West via the Sega CD port, which is still the only English language release, as the TurboGrafx 16 mini version is all in Japanese. Good thing it's considered abandonware. And there you have it, folks, every Metal Gear game in chronological order. I'm a huge fan of this franchise, so this was a really fun one to do. Personally, my favorite out of all of these is Metal Gear Solid 2, but let us know in the comments what your favorite Metal Gear game is. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe, and as always, be sure to visit GameRant.com for more top-notch gaming content. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you in the next video. Take care for now.